Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo has refuted claims that he and former President Jacob Zuma have ever been friends, nor have they had any close ties. This follows Zuma's application to have Zondo recuse himself as the chairperson of the state capture inquiry, citing historic personal and professional relations. Yesterday, advocate Muzi Sikhakhane, representing the former president, told Zondo that his client sees the commission as a slaughterhouse, as he believes that particular witnesses brought to testify feed the narrative that Zuma has already been found guilty. Lawson Naidoo, the Executive Director for the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, says that Zuma's application is baseless and that this is a ploy to avoid testifying before the Commission. And he joins us now. Lawson, good to have you. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Good morning, Leanne.
So, to quote, you said that this is yet another attempt, or not yet another, or is an attempt from the former president not to testify before the Zondo Commission. Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on this.
Well, yes. I mean, I think what became clear yesterday in the course of all of the legal argument that took place before the Deputy Chief Justice was that Mr. Zuma's legal team made it clear that he was not going to testify before this Commission of Inquiry. Mr. Sikhakhane had said, for example, that if the Deputy Chief Justice dismisses their application for his recusal, they will go to court and seek to review that decision, and they will take it all the way, with the words that he used. That would really mean that this matter gets tied up in the courts for probably many years, and we know that the Commission has got to end its work and submit its report by March next year. Later on in the proceedings, it was also interesting that Mr. Sikhakhane said that, and again he used his words, he says, when we review your report. So it seems that Mr. Zuma's legal team have already taken a decision to review the Zondo report as it will come to be known in the future, even though they don't know what's in it. So the legal strategy is clear. We're going to challenge this all the way, and we're not going to cooperate.
Yeah. There's also, when you're saying that Zuma's application for Zondo to recuse himself is baseless, did you feel that and get the sense yesterday as well that there is actually nothing that could implicate Zondo, or perhaps there is? I mean, after listening yesterday, do you still feel it's baseless?
Probably even more so now. I think what was interesting yesterday was the fact that at the start of the proceedings, Leanne, the Deputy Chief Justice read out a statement from himself, giving his version of his interactions and relations with Mr. Zuma dating back to the early 1990s. And he made it clear that it was a professional relationship. Yes, Mr. Zuma had consulted him on occasion as an attorney, that they had met at various government functions, but the Deputy Chief Justice was adamant in saying, we are not friends, and I'm able to be impartial. He pointed to the fact that he'd heard many cases sitting as a judge on the Constitutional Court in which the former president was either an applicant or a respondent, and his impartiality had never been challenged before. So I think it really was a very feeble attempt. I think what was impressive and may have given them some hope was that in the morning, I thought Advocate Sikhakhane was very cogent in his legal argument, even though there was a disagreement between the two legal teams as to what is the proper test for the recusal of the presiding officer. There was a cogent argument put forward. But when it came to it after the tea break, I think it was, for him to then convince the judge that he needed to step down, the facts didn't back up his legal argument, and he was really at a stretch saying that a state capture is a political missile sent to deal with the former president, that witnesses were lined up against him, and so on. And I don't think any of that was persuasive enough. This is a commission of inquiry; it's not a court of law, and the Justice Zondo has the responsibility to question witnesses to get clarity, which is what he has been doing.
So let's now look at both sides of what is going to happen, because Justice Zondo also finds himself in a very precarious situation. He has to make this decision. He's busy sitting there. I mean, it was pretty uncomfortable, I can imagine, for Justice to be sitting there listening to this, and he has to make this decision. I mean, the chances of him actually recusing himself, because he's the one that needs to make this decision. You know, what is going through his mind at a time like this? I'm asking you to speculate, obviously, but, you know, looking at a law perspective, what does one do in this situation?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the Deputy Chief Justice, you know, is clearly taking this seriously, and the questions that he asked yesterday of both legal teams, seeking clarity as to their positions, that, you know, he will properly consider this application. And, you know, he kept asking the question was, what happens if I recuse myself? Because there's nobody else to preside. Then the president is going to have to appoint someone to preside over Mr. Zuma's testimony. You know, how does that reconcile with the fact that Justice Zondo has heard all of the other testimony? And if there's a disagreement between Justice Zondo and the person who hears Mr. Zuma's testimony, how is that reconciled in the final report? So these are practical difficulties. So, you know, whilst I say, you know, I think Mr. Zuma's argument is weak, you know, Mr. Sikhakhane certainly, you know, gave the Deputy President, the Deputy Chief Justice something to think about overnight. And his decision this morning will be an interesting one. Yes, he is the person charged with making that decision, but that's the case in all recusal applications, even in courts of law. It's that the very judge who is asked to stand aside who has to hear the application in the first instance.
So let's now look at the scenario where Justice Zondo says, I am not recusing myself. And then, of course, Zuma, our former president, refuses to testify once again. I know that he would be compelled to testify before the commission, as we know, but he has, of course, the right not to answer any questions, as we've seen before, with other witnesses who have appeared. Do you agree that would probably be the route that he would go, and we'd actually get nothing out of the former president? Or what happens next if Zondo refuses to recuse himself?
Well, I think the first thing that would happen, Leanne, is that Mr. Zuma and his legal team will launch review proceedings against the decision of the Deputy Chief Justice in the courts, and ask the court to make a decision on his recusal. And again, this was something that Mr. Sikhakhane revealed in the course of his argument yesterday. And then second, he also said that, you know, if we lose and you force me to bring Mr. Zuma here, in the words of Mr. Sikhakhane, I will bring him here, but he will not answer your questions. So I think the strategy is absolutely clear. Whichever way it goes, Mr. Zuma has absolutely no intention to cooperate with the commission. You know, Mr. Pretorius, the evidence leader for the commission, made it clear in the afternoon that Mr. Zuma had been requested on many occasions to provide affidavits and responses to testimony where he was implicated, and he has simply failed to do so. He's not done anything except for the testimony he gave in July last year, where he came and made very wild accusations, calling members of his former cabinet spies and so on, and referring to various intelligence reports, but nothing that, you know, that speaks to the actual issues that the Deputy Chief Justice is investigating, which all emanate from the Public Protector's State of Capture report, again, when Mr. Zuma failed to cooperate with the then Public Protector, Thuli Madonsela.
Advocate Sikhakhane also argued that the commission is being used to peddle political conspiracies. What are your thoughts on this particular argument?
Well, again, one goes back to the Public Protector's report, because that's the basis for this commission of inquiry. There was, you know, Public Protector made it clear that this phenomenon of, you know, there was sufficient evidence to suggest that there was a phenomenon of state capture from the testimony that she had heard from various witnesses, and recommended the establishment of a judicial commission to investigate this further. And, you know, the Deputy Chief Justice has constantly called on people in South Africa to come forward if they have information and evidence about state capture, corruption or fraud. And people have responded to that. Now, Mr. Sikhakhane sought to make a lot of the fact that state capture is not a crime. Well, I don't think anybody has seriously suggested that it's a crime, and the Commission is not a criminal court. It's a fact-finding mission, and charges relating to that, which would generally be fraud, corruption, and perhaps racketeering, charges with which Mr. Zuma is very familiar. will emerge from that. So, state capture is not a crime per se. It is a political, socio-political phenomenon. And that's something that we know in South Africa. South Africa has existed. We, as ordinary people, have felt its existence. So, Mr. Zuma was once again playing the victim, that he's being treated unfairly, he's being prejudged. But I don't think that ordinary South Africans buy any of that.
Again, Zuma's lawyer saying that the Deputy Chief Justice has crossed the line with his comments when other witnesses testify. Do you agree with this? And there are some schools of thought that say that they do agree with what the lawyer has said. Do you think that perhaps Zondo should refrain from making comments during these testimonies? Because this, of course, is creating the impression, as Zuma's lawyer has said, that this is a slaughterhouse and that a decision has already been made as to whether Zuma is guilty or not.
Well, look, Leanne, I think we know as South Africans, we've come to learn a lot about our Deputy Chief Justice over the last 2.5 years or so. And that's very much his style. He's very informal in the city. He's not, he's well aware he's not presiding in a court of law. He's conducting an investigation. He's the lead investigator, effectively. Yes, he has a team of lawyers and investigators assisting him. But it's his responsibility to write this report at the end of the day. And he needs to have clarity in his mind of things that are being said in front of him. And so he engages with witnesses. He asks questions. He's commended people for coming forward and giving testimony. And I think he's done that, on numerous occasions. Yes, Mr. Zuma will point out, well, it's the fact that it was, Ms. Barbara Hogan, Praveen Gordhan, Nkebisi Jonas, Themba Maseko, etc. Well, if those people's testimony was convincing, Mr. Zuma had the right to step in and cross-examine any of all of them. He's not taken up that opportunity. Instead, he comes there yesterday and accuses the Deputy Chief Justice of not being impartial. So I think it's difficult for Mr. Zuma to sustain that argument that he's being victimized, that the Deputy Chief Justice is being unfair on him and has prejudged the matter. Mr. Sikhakhane was at pains earlier in the day to say, Mr. Zondo, we are not challenging your integrity. So, if you're not challenging his integrity, you accept his impartiality. But you're saying that my client, Mr. Zuma, thinks he's being unfairly targeted. Well, that's where the legal difference comes in, because Mr. Pretorius in the afternoon says, well, that's not the legal test. The legal test is whether a reasonable person would perceive the Deputy Chief Justice to be impartial or not. And I think if the latter is the correct test, then this application will certainly fail.
You talk about Mr. Pretorius, because I know that he came in, as you say, a little bit later on in the day, evidence leader Paul Pretorius, and basically said that if Zondo recuses himself for Zuma's testimony, this would collapse the commission. Do you think that that would be the case, that the entire commission would be collapsed if we see that Zondo recuses himself for just the Zuma testimony and then comes back on? What would you think the consequences thereof are?
Well, it certainly have a massive impact on the Commission of Inquiry. I'm not sure that I would go so far as to say it would collapse the inquiry. If the Deputy Chief Justice were to step aside, forever from now on, that would create a huge problem, because we had 2 years of this commission. We've spent nearly R1 billion on this commission, and if we suddenly just end it now, then it would have a major impact. There would be the report that comes out of it would be pretty futile. But if, on the other hand, the Deputy Chief Justice was simply to step aside from Mr. Zuma's testimony, can we really be certain that Mr. Zuma will then come forward and take the nation into his confidence and give us, tell us everything he knows? On his previous track record, I'm afraid, I think the odds on that are pretty low. So this is just a stalling tactically, and Mr. Zuma, I don't think, has any intention of collaborating with the Commission. And I think the challenge to the Deputy Chief Justice, which is one, again, that was put to yesterday, is that without Mr. Zuma's evidence or testimony, the Deputy Chief Justice is going to have to decide whether there's sufficient evidence presented before him for him to make findings regarding the conduct of Mr. Zuma, not to find him guilty or not guilty, that's not his job, whether he can make findings about Mr. Zuma's conduct in relation to the Guptas and state-owned companies and the like, and whether he recommends further investigation and perhaps prosecution by the law enforcement agencies. That's really the decision that the Deputy Chief Justice will have to make with or without Mr. Zuma's testimony.
Just finally, we're obviously seeing this continuing today. As you mentioned, it has been said that if it isn't decided in former President Zuma's favor, they're going to take this again on review. Every day delayed, every minute that is delayed is costing the taxpayer money. And we know how much this commission is costing us. So to hear words like, this would collapse the commission, this is going to be delayed even further, we're not going to get further on this. And, these are things that South Africans are worried about. We've seen this going on for years to the tune of, you would even know better than I do in terms of how much this has cost South Africans. And by sitting and being stalled, it's costing us even more money.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've all been shocked by the costs that have been utilized by the Commission. I think at the last count it was 770 million, estimated that it's going to require another 100 million before it completes its work in March next year. So that's a huge amount of money, especially in the context of the kind of fiscal crisis that we're in at the moment. It is a lot of money, but, this is a very necessary process to try and get to the bottom of what happened in South Africa, that, the former public protector started unraveling in her report. And I think it's essential that we do that, not simply to hold people to account for what they did, although that's a critical part of the work of this commission, but also to provide recommendations to say, what do we need to fix within our institutional culture, within our organs of state, to ensure that this doesn't happen again. So at the end of the day, many would argue, well, it's cost a lot of money, but it's money well spent if it helps us to move away, to hold people accountable, and to put in place the changes that are necessary to strengthen our democracy.
We leave it there for this morning. Thank you. Lawson Naidoo talking to us from CASAC for about basically what's happening at the Zondo Commission. And so today, the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo is going to decide whether to recuse himself or not from the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. I'm sure you'll be watching, Lawson, as we will all be doing. Let's take a break.